Carlton Brown, author of Brainstorm, meets John K.M. McCaffrey, Orville Prescott, and Dr. Gregory Zilberg in The Author Meets the Critics. And as chairman, here's the fiction editor of American Magazine, John K.M. McCaffrey.
Brainstorm is a novel about a man who went mad. And for such a book, we've invited a psychiatrist and a literary critic. We felt we needed both. Our guests are Dr. Gregory Zilberg, the distinguished psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, and Orville Prescott, who writes daily book reviews for the New York Times. Dr. Zilberg, Mr. Prescott, and I will have the floor to ourselves first, while Carlton Brown, our author, sits on the sidelines taking notes. Mr. Brown, though, will have a fair chance to defend himself later in the program. Meanwhile, every member of our radio audience is invited to sit as a judge in this literary tug-of-war, and here's how you can participate.
At the close of this program, after you've heard The Author Meets the Critics, we're going to ask what's your verdict on Brainstorm by Carlton Brown. Do you or do you not intend to read it? We bring you this program in the hope that it will help you make a choice, whatever that choice may be, favorable or unfavorable. And through the courtesy of the Book of the Month Club, we're able to award 3 unusual book prizes for the best comments from listeners. I'll have more details for you later, but now here's Mr. McCaffrey.
This is perhaps one of the most difficult books to describe to a radio audience, if any we've had on, certainly any that we've had on this season. It's a book, as I said, about a man who goes mad. And the major part of the book, the actual book proper, starts out with his state of elation, which drives him to greater and greater heights and finally lands him in what I take to be Bellevue, and then on to a state hospital and through to his release. Before the opening chapter of the book proper, there's a little resume of Michael Kelly Jones, the hero of Michael Kelly Jones' career before this unfortunate occurrence. We find out from that resume that he was the son of divorced parents between whom there was a considerable amount of bitterness, that he led a rather irregular life from the point of view of security, emotional as well as financial, that he traveled greatly but always in a rather sporadic, somewhat uncontrolled way. He had a good many emotional experiences with women. They, too, seem casual and sporadic, of greater and less intensity. He became married to Helen, with whom he had great difficulty from the very beginning of their marriage. That is, they got along very well, and then there would be periods where they fought and bickered bitterly. This is the picture of Jones as we get him. He was a writer, a magazine writer primarily, a sort of a virtuoso personality, quick to react to people, quick to react to all the external phenomena of his life, and then the novel proper of this state of high elation which led him into delusions, religious delusions, and other kinds of mania begins. From a literary point of view, Mr. Prescott, what did you think of this book as a novel?
Well, as a novel, it presents a question. I kept wondering whether it was one. And then this is supposed to be the fictionalization of a real man's case. And so all the time you're balancing, should I accept this as fiction, or shall I worry whether this is an accurate picture of a certain institution where there's brutal mismanagement or not, and that kind of thing. You're always forgetting that it's a novel, and you can't lose yourself in it because of that problem. And then comes the problem of it's a popular case history of a madman. And then when you're reading fiction, you wonder, how authoritative is Mr. Brown? Are madmen really like this, or is this just his good guess at it? So once again, you couldn't lose yourself in it. But madness has such a fascination for the layman that you're continually interested just the same. And I was interested from the word go all the way through, although I have reservations about its success as a work of art, but I was continuously interested.
How do you feel about it as a novel, as a work of art?
Well, as a novel, it lacks one of the most essential ingredients, and this is the sense of conflict, the sense of inner conflict. I can't imagine a novel in which there is no real conflict within the people, and this book presents only a sense of tension between the men who succumbed to a nervous or a mental illness and find themselves in an environment, pseudo or actually therapeutic, curative, and which he doesn't feel, well, he doesn't feel well. There is no sense of struggle, no sense of victory, even in this recovery.
Well, what about his struggle with himself? After all, isn't any case of madness the story of one of the most profound struggles that any man could have, that is, with this other part of his personality which comes up to grapple with him? Mr. Prescott.
Seems to me that he didn't struggle until he was cured, and then he struggled to resume a normal life. But most of the book is a passive victim. That's one of the... He seems to endure these things, but not to do anything about it. Dr. Zillberg's right. There is no general
But don't
conflict.
you feel, in his depiction of the character, that he shows you constantly, as he goes through his case history of madness, that he shows you enormous sources of conflict, certainly in his own life, that you can, as he goes through his state of madness, see this as a reflection of conflict?
Reflection of the unhappy stresses and strains, the emotional turmoil in which he lived that drove him mad, yes.
That's something that interests me. Did you get a very good picture, Dr. Zillborg, of the actual causes, despite the beginning of the book, which is supposed to be explanatory? Did you get a very good picture of the causes of his madness?
Frankly, no. I have made a note here on page 153, which is very revealing. There was nothing mentioned, for instance, about the mother of the patient or the mother's religious attitude. And on page 153, the sick man says that he always felt uncomfortable about the religious attitude of his mother. Now, that's an important trend, but as we psychiatrists would say, it remained repressed for 153 pages, casually mentioned on page 153, and never to be come back to throughout the thing.
That was one of the things that interested me about the book as a whole, in that there were an extraordinary number of ellipses left out. That is, you didn't understand often what the hero's relationship was to characters which he would bring in quite casually. He didn't supply you with sufficient information so that you could spot that character within the book. Almost, it seems, as if at times the writing was following the pattern of the mania.
No, this is not so much the pattern of the mania. And by the way, since I am participating here with my professional title of psychiatrist, I would like to omit the word mania, which is no more a technical term and no more descriptive in the colloquial language and the idiom of anything that is real. There is no mania. This man had certain delusions, certain qualities of illusions, and I think that the shadowy quality of some of the persons who appear are due primarily to the fact that the man who is sick is so deeply absorbed in his own self, and the people around him are only partial participants in a life. He doesn't love them deeply. He doesn't hate them deeply. They are walking like shadows during his illness. The only real wrath that you see in the book, scorn, and powerful scorn, comes up when he touches on the social implication of the lack of humanitarian attitude on the part of those people who are supposed to treat patients. When he describes Dr. Soup, it's a marvelous description. That person is really living and reminds me of our...
That doctor is the doctor who was the doctor primarily in charge of the hero's case. Dr. Soup, he called him, a pseudonym, obviously.
And it's interesting. I'm in this respect reminded of the great Johnson, whom Boswell convinced that he ought to go to a concert. And he went to a concert and sat impassively, and Boswell became very much enthusiastic about the lady who sang beautifully, and he applauded and says, "Is she not marvelous? Is she not wonderful, doctor? And it is very, very difficult." And Johnson says, "Yes, I wish it were impossible." And this is what I would think about Soup. It's very difficult to take care of people. I wish he were impossible.
I'd like to raise a point, Mr. McCaffrey. Dr. Zillberg spoke of the absence of conflict. And perhaps the whole theory of fiction should be that it deals with people with whom we can associate ourselves, feel that their problems were conceivably ones we could share. And when you read a novel about a man who is really mad, not just suffering from some interesting neuroses or something, he becomes purely a case history. Interesting because we're always interested in psychiatry. It's so fashionable, and that I keep hearing about it all the time.
We're glad to hear that, Dr. Zilberg.
But it doesn't seem a rewarding subject for fiction, because you don't get into it. It's just someone in an insane asylum.
Well, I'd like to take issue with that to a certain extent, Mr. Prescott, in that I feel, perhaps I'm wrong, and Dr. Zilberg can correct me if I am, probably am, it seems to me that after all, the seeds for this abnormal behavior can be found in any man's behavior, not ending up in this unfortunate and disastrous way, that after all, a neurosis is perhaps just a less extreme form of a psychotic state. Am I right or am I wrong, Doctor?
For purposes of argument, let's assume you're right.
Well, then, we're all bound for the insane asylum, but most of us stop short, and Michael Kelly Jones goes the whole way. That's defensible.
Well, I don't think that, if I may now intrude, due to your suggestion, Mr. McCaffrey, I would say this. I don't think that there's anybody more insane than Smerdyakov and Brother Karamazov, or Dmitry Karamazov, or some of the characters in Guy de Maupassant. And yet they seem to us alive. It is apparently the nature of the madness and the way it is presented that makes us feel perhaps a little bit foreign or strange to it. I think the absence of conflict in this particular case is too conspicuous to be considered an accidental thing. And I think that when Mr. Brown writes his second book, he'll probably start with this point he finishes this on. With that element of true scorn, which is totally suppressed in this case history. This case history is so partial that one of the biggest hunks of human emotion remains totally unpresented. And that's why it doesn't appeal to me.
I was interested, Dr. Zilberg, in the fact that from the very beginning of the book, he makes the point that the person who finds himself psychotic has, as he says, no one but himself to blame. That this is not the result of circumstances, that if you examine the steps which led you to this unfortunate state, that you'll find that after all, you did it all yourself. That was a surprising attitude for me to find in the book. Were you at all surprised?
No, I wasn't surprised. I just disapproved of it.
You disapproved of it. You do not believe that such self-blame is necessary to the...
No, that self-blame, the statement which appears as self-blame, is the germ of the depression that later on sets in. In actuality, you can say that insofar as you are constitutionally weaker in some spots and stronger in others, in an epidemic of pneumonia, you will not catch pneumonia. In an epidemic of typhoid fever, you might catch an eye wound. Take your choice. Now, under these circumstances, you could say that you have nobody but yourself to blame for having done what you have done with the typhoid when you caught it. No, I believe that what the man wanted to say in this book was that when you develop a severe mental illness, it is in you, and it's what happens to you, and it's the manner in which you handle yourself that illness develops or you recover from it. But to bring in the principle of responsibility in illness is a rather dangerous thing. They did it in the 15th century, and they burned a couple of million people.
Well, didn't he actually make that point in the book, the correlation between some of the brutal treatment which he received and the brutal treatment which madmen generally received in the Middle Ages?
But this is the charitableness that I never forgave.
But he stresses that the man brought it upon himself over the course of many years. He proves that when he was young, he began to drink and became a perpetual alcoholic. which was a good first step towards his madness. He had,
Not necessarily.
Wasn't that symptomatic?
It would express the same weakness, wouldn't it, Doctor, or some?
No. If you consider madness as a weakness, then we'll think. Madness is neither a weakness nor a fall from the righteous path, nor a man could be a drunk and not be psychotic, as you put it. I speak of mental illnesses. And there are a great many psychotics who have never partaken of spirits at all. There are some of them...
Sorry, there's the signal, Doctor. Time's up for the critics. Now it's our author's turn.
Wonderful.
But before we introduce Carlton Brown, a word to our listeners about our book prices. Every member of the radio audience is invited to sit as a judge on The Author Meets the Critics. After hearing both sides, the author and the critics, what do you think of Brainstorm? Do you or do you not intend to read it? If you do, tell us why. If not, why not? The Author Meets the Critics hope that it has helped you make up your mind. So send us your comments, favorable or unfavorable, on Brainstorm by Carlton Brown. And for the 3 best letters or postcards submitted by listeners, the Book of the Month Club will award unusual book prizes. At the close of the program, we'll have all the details for you. But now, we know you're anxious to hear from our author. And here he is, Mr. Carlton Brown.
I'm somewhat at a loss for words. I can't defend myself very well from all of the criticisms that have been made of the book without sounding like a very vain person. I might have wished that I'd had a couple of the other critics on the panel who had liked the book and had found it moving and accurate and a number of other things.
I found it very interesting. Don't misjudge me.
I know.
I found it very accurate, too.
Mr. Brown, was profoundly moved.
Thank you. I made a few notes, none of them very important. One, Mr. McCaffrey said that he assumed the hospital was Bellevue. A good many people did. And that is a natural assumption. However, this is a true story, and the hospital was not Bellevue. That goes into Mr. Prescott's question of whether it was a novel or a factual story. It was very clearly stated in the preface that it was a true story. However, that it was assumed that may have been a literary device. I think that the book is not a work of art insofar as it is a true story. That's a very difficult point to make.
I think a dubious point would be a better way to put it, Mr. Brown, but go ahead.
Well, I mean that simply by trying as well as I could to stick to the period of the madness itself, rather than to try to go back into this fellow's early life and into the conflict which Dr. Zilborg misses, which set off this madness, the novel suffered. It was not a novel of this fellow in his relation to anything but the madness. As a matter of fact, the first chapter was an afterthought, the one about what went before. It was felt by the publishers that some explanation was needed of this.
Well, don't you think that our point, in essence, Mr. Brown, was the fact that even in a book which takes a frame or a slice out of life, that in that slice you must get some seeds of the beginning and some feeling toward the ultimate end? I think that John Dewey, in a very good book on aesthetics, Art as Experience, speaks of every aesthetic experience as beginning out of, coming in kind of an arc out of experience and reaching a climax and sinking down again into experience. But in that arc, you must be able to see both the beginning and the end.
Well, I think you can find the seeds of it to some extent in the story. I think it's rather doubtful whether a layman can take such a subject and say definitely that it was this factor or that factor which drove the young man crazy.
Not even a psychiatrist could do that.
No, I don't. I think that's true because I consulted with quite a few psychiatrists in writing this book, and I received quite a few divergent opinions as to what the cause might be. For that reason, I omitted a long explanation of.
Do you think maybe it's too dangerous a subject for a layman author, and you can't be sure enough of yourself or inspire enough confidence in your readers?
I don't see why it should be. It's a human experience, and I was in possession of a good deal of material. It seemed to me very unusual, very worthwhile presenting to people, because it seemed to me that in part it showed that the breach was not so huge between the normal and the abnormal. And one of my purposes in writing the book was just that, to try to show that when people became mentally ill, they did not become no longer people. That seems to me a popular assumption. We regard the insane.
If I may
as being
interrupt you for a moment,
removed.
Mr. Brown. The mistake you made, I think, and take this as a most
Constructive
benevolent rather than psychiatric criticism. The mistake you made is that you consulted several psychiatrists. If you consulted only one, and that one were me, it would have been still a greater mistake. And the reason for it is this: your book shows signs of the confusion of tongues that exists among psychiatrists who follow Thomas Hobbes' tradition to the effect that the language is given to us to conceal our thoughts. The book is so direct. You relate an actual experience, and then there is so much terminological confusion and fog put in here in between that it creates a sense of discomfort.
I think it should be said parenthetically that the only psychiatrist who is directly quoted in the book is Dr. Gregory Zilberg, and he is quoted twice, and very well quoted, I might say, Mr. Brown.
I think we also should point out that
I'm
these
so ungrateful.
that these psychiatric matters, which are confusion of tongues to a psychiatrist, are just the things that are interesting the public and making the book sell well, and it's why people want to talk about Brainstorm.
Well, I didn't feel that there was a great deal of psychiatric explanation in it, except as it concerned the fellow, as he came up against it, as he came up against conflicting opinions. There may have been
Perhaps
a bit of
I should have said the whole psychiatric problem. I included the delusions themselves, the strange religious messianic misconceptions.
One of the things that interested me most about the character was something I spoke of earlier, and that is it's the virtuoso nature of the hero. In the book, he is constantly making designs of one kind or another. He either decorates his apartment walls in murals, he makes little designs out of some precious stones and some water lilies, which he puts in a glass battery jar. All through the book, these designs run through. He even writes some poetry, which is of an extraordinarily virtuosic nature, in that if you read through the poetry, which runs for about 3 pages, you see that he has very skillfully paraphrased almost every type of poetry that you could get. You could have an opening which is very much like Lovelace and Suckling in the beginning of the 17th century poets, and you'll find a good deal that's like Amy Lowell. You'll find some that even has strong parallels to Wordsworth and the nature poets. All through it, we have a virtuoso talent which never seems to come to anything. It seemed to me to be one of the best literary indications of the type of mania that the hero had. What did you think of those things, Dr. Zilberg?
This is exactly the thing that interests me so much. The person, the individual in question, lives a great deal of his life only in his own fantasy. He seldom brings it out into the open in the form of true acts, except getting drunk occasionally. And as a result, he breaks down into a most florid type of a life. And when he does break down in what is called Brainstorm, to satisfy the publishers, then he becomes active, he dances, he becomes choreographic in his fantasies. He does a number of things.
You think his incipient madness might have been indicated by his fondness for swing music, the writings of James Joyce, and surrealist painting? That interested me immensely. Let's ask the author whether he meant it to be a sign of madness.
Mr. Prescott, you talk almost in the tone of almost a deliberate understatement of a James Russell Lowell,
I find that in the terms, deliberate understatement of an Orville Prescott would be far more to the point, Dr. Zilborg, on this particular
No, I
subject.
don't think that Joyce had anything to do with that. We might continue to read Joyce. But I think what had to do a great deal with this boy is the fact that he never was able, and he says it in the book, but doesn't say it quite openly, conspicuously, but he never was able to decide whether he wants to be a father like his father or a mother like his mother. There is a touch in his delusion, one of the most interesting elements in the whole psychosis, a concept that he will be a woman and will conceive immaculately a Christ child instead of himself being a redeemer.
I don't remember that.
I'll show it to you.
Was that really in the book?
Yes, I remember that very strongly myself, Mr. Brown.
And the fact that you don't remember that is rather significant because you are not a psychiatrist.
I must read it again.
By all means. And this is probably the very root of the whole problem. The man has what you call virtuosity. This is the sense of a messianic wish to be a doer. And at the same time, he passively, as Ms. Prescott said, passively accepts certain blows of life from within and without. Accept them, contemplate them, and doesn't know which way he will be born, either by being reborn or by giving birth, whether he be a man or a woman.
He set up a very elaborate symbolism throughout the entire book, the use of the semi-precious stones, all of the designs to express these things. Were you impressed in the writing of the book with these recurrent symbols which came through? The swing music, semi-precious stones, I remember, the patchwork designs which were made out of anything from coconut husks to electric light bulbs.
Well, they were presented very deliberately as a part of his madness. The swing music, however, I'd like to take issue with Mr. Prescott, and I noticed it in his review. If everyone who were interested in swing music, Joyce, and some of the other things that our young man was interested in were on the verge of a breakdown, the world would be in a sad position.
Isn't the world in a very sad position?
Oh, sad.
Hitler is not interested in swing music.
Yes, as a matter of fact, it's a degenerate form of art to him. Did you feel yourself that it was a whole experience in writing it, Mr. Brown?
I didn't feel that it was a complete book. It wasn't intended to be more than a description of an episode.
But there's the final signal, and time's up for both the author and the critics. Do you or do you not intend to read Brainstorm by Carlton Brown after what you've heard this evening? Tell us in a short letter or postcard, 50 words or so, whether we've helped you make a choice, whatever that choice may be. And to the writers of the 3 best entries, the Book of the Month Club would award full-year book subscriptions. Here's what one of these prizes includes. A full-year subscription entitles you to every choice of the judges of the Book of the Month Club for the next 12 months, beginning with the 2 March selections, Black Boy by Richard Wright and Apartment at Athens by Glenway Westcott. In addition, winners will receive all the book dividends distributed by the club throughout the year. Remember, we award 3 of these prizes every week. Address your entry to The Author Meets the Critics in care of station WHN, New York City. Winners for last week's program featuring Young'un by Herbert Best were Mrs. Lionel W. Stafford, 290 West 12th Street, New York, Mrs. Martin Landsberg, 7139 Nansen Street, Forest Hills, New York, and Mrs. Harriet B. Cunningham, Newport, New York. And now here's Mr. McCaffrey to tell us about next week.
Next week's author of the evening is the brilliant author of Native Son, Richard Wright. Richard Wright's new book will be released for publication this week. It is his autobiography. It's called Black Boy, and from all the advance reports, it seems destined to be one of the really great books of the year. Sterling North of the New York Post, who we're happy to announce is back in good health, will be one of our guests next week, along with Louis Gannett, daily reviewer for the New York Herald Tribune. If you'd like to see the broadcast here at the Barbizon Plaza Hotel, address your request for tickets to The Author Meets the Critic, station WHN, New York City. Before closing, we'd like to say thanks to Carlton Brown for joining us this evening, and many thanks to you, too, Dr. Zilberg, and to you, Orville Prescott, for your very good help in the Critics' Corner. This is John K. M. McCaffrey saying good night for The Author Meets the Critics.
The announcer has been Dave Murphy. You are tuned to 1050.
Presto transcription. C-I-E-L-S, yes. Springfield's beer, the beer that's light. C-I-E-L-S. 7 good things make it.